In Victorian London, a single penny carried a weight that is difficult to imagine today. It was small, dull, easily lost between the fingers, yet it decided something enormous. Warmth or cold, inside or outside, survival or slow danger. For thousands of people moving through the city each night, life narrowed down to that single coin. Not comfort, not dignity, just one penny and what it could buy before darkness fully settled in. London in the late 19th century was a city of sharp contrasts. Wealth and hunger lived side by side, sometimes separated by nothing more than a narrow street or a thin brick wall. Gas lamps flickered above cobblestones slick with damp, their orange light struggling against fog thick with coal smoke. The city smelled of burning fuel, wet stone, horses, and human presence pressed too closely together. Even after sunset, London did not rest. It breathed, shifted, and endured. For those without money, night was not a time for sleep. It was a problem that needed solving. Cold settled into the bones after sunset, especially in winter. Damp crept upward from the streets, through thin soles and torn coats. Standing still too long could numb the feet. Lying down in the wrong place could invite the attention of police, who enforced laws that treated poverty itself as a crime. The city demanded movement, even from those with nowhere to go. A penny could buy food, a small meat pie of uncertain origin, a cup of thin coffee ladled from a street cart, a piece of bread baked yesterday and already hard at the edges. These things mattered, but hunger could wait a little longer. Cold could not. Once night fell fully, warmth became more valuable than a full stomach. Shelter, even the harshest version of it, became a form of safety. For many, earning that penny took hours. Standing outside public houses holding horses while their owners drank inside. Carrying crates at markets for anyone willing to pay. Running messages, sweeping floors, watching doors. The work was unreliable, the pay uncertain. Fingers stiffened from cold while waiting. Muscles ached long before night arrived. By evening, the penny was often warm from being clutched too tightly all day, as if holding it close could make it last longer. The penny was not about comfort. It was about avoiding the street. Sleeping outdoors was dangerous, not only because of the weather, but because it drew attention. Victorian London did not tolerate visible homelessness. Police moved people along, questioned them, arrested them when they chose. A person found sleeping rough could be accused of vagrancy and sent to prison or hard labour. The streets belonged to movement, not rest. Indoors, even the poorest shelter felt like protection. Walls blocked the wind. A roof kept out rain and fog. Being inside meant fewer questions, fewer boots nudging you awake, fewer hands forcing you to move on. It meant existing within the city's rules, however harsh they were. A penny was the fee to remain unseen, unnoticed, and for a few hours relatively safe. Yet the penny also represented how fragile survival had become. There was no room for saving, no way to plan beyond the next night. Each day reset the struggle. Yesterday's coin was gone by morning. Tomorrow's did not exist yet. Life shrank into a repeating cycle of earning, choosing, and enduring. The city did not care how tired you were. Night arrived whether you were ready or not. Those who had once lived ordinary lives often found themselves here. Former clerks, factory workers, labourers, men and women who had paid rent and eaten regular meals not long before. Illness, layoffs, death of an employer, a single missed payment. These things pushed people out of stability quickly. Once fallen, climbing back was slow and uncertain. Pride dissolved faster than hunger. As evening deepened, crowds shifted. People with purpose hurried home. Shops closed their doors. Windows glowed briefly, then darkened. Those without a destination began drifting toward places they had heard about from others like them. Not spoken of loudly, not advertised, just known. Shelters that asked for very little because they offered very little in return. The penny in a pocket became heavy with meaning. Spend it on food and face the night outdoors, risking cold and arrest. Spend it on shelter and endure whatever conditions waited inside. There was no good choice, only a less dangerous one. The penny demanded a decision, and the decision had to be made before the city fully turned its back. In this world, sleep was no longer a natural human act. It was rationed, controlled, priced. Rest had rules. Warmth had limits. Privacy disappeared entirely, yet people adapted because they had to. The body learned new ways to endure. The mind learned to narrow its focus. Survival became quiet, repetitive, and deeply exhausting. As night settled over Victorian London, one penny decided everything. Not happiness, not hope, just whether a person would face the darkness alone or surrounded by others doing the same. It was a small coin, but it carried the price of one more night lived. When night fell over London in 1887, it did not bring silence. It brought a different rhythm. The daylight noise of carts, factories, and shouting streets softened, but it never disappeared. Instead, the city slipped into a low, constant murmur, like breathing that could be felt more than heard. Footsteps echoed longer on cobblestones. Voices dropped into quieter tones. Somewhere, always, something was moving. Gas lamps lined the streets in uneven intervals, their yellow-orange flames flickering behind fog-streaked glass. They did not banish the darkness so much as shape it, carving out small islands of light surrounded by shadow. Between one lamp and the next, the street dissolved into uncertainty. Faces appeared suddenly, then vanished just as quickly. Buildings loomed close, their brick walls damp and stained, leaning inward as if listening. The foe. G was never just fog. It carried the weight of the city with it. Coal smoke from thousands of fires mixed with damp river air, creating a haze that clung to clothing and settled in the throat. It smelled metallic and bitter, a taste that lingered long after breathing it in. Some nights it was thin and drifting, other nights it pressed low and thick, turning streets into tunnels and reducing the world to a few blurred steps ahead. Horse-drawn traffic slowed after dark, but it never stopped. Hooves struck stone with a steady, hollow sound. Carriages rattled past, wheels hissing through wet patches left behind by the day. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted, impatient and tired. The animals endured the city just as people did, moving through long hours with little rest. Shops closed early in poorer districts, their shutters pulled down with dull thuds. In wealthier areas, windows glowed warmly behind heavy curtains, hiding interiors filled with furniture, firelight, and evening meals. The contrast was sharp but quiet. No walls announced it, no signs explained it. One street simply felt warmer than the next. Along the pavements, people with destinations walked quickly, clerks returning to rented rooms, labourers heading toward narrow houses packed with families, women carrying parcels close to their bodies. They moved with purpose, eyes forward, coats buttoned tight. Night rewarded those who knew where they were going. Others moved differently, slower, hesitant, lingering beneath lay MPs or near doorways. These were people measuring the evening, calculating how long they could remain in one place before drawing attention. They paused not to rest, but to decide. Every stop carried risk. Standing still too long invited questions. Sitting down invited removal. The police were more visible at night. Dark uniforms blending into shadows, boots echoing sharply as they walked their routes. Their presence was not constant, but it was enough to be felt. A figure at the end of the street, a sudden turn of a head, a pause that lasted a second too long. Authority moved quietly, but it was always nearby. Public houses spilled light and sound onto the streets. Laughter, arguments, bursts of song escaped through open doors before being swallowed by fog. Inside, warmth and drink softened the edges of the day. Outside, men waited, offering to hold horses for a chance at a coin. Their breath rose in pale clouds as they stood still, hands stiff, watching for someone generous or careless enough to pay. Markets quieted after sunset, but they never fully emptied. Vendors packed away unsold goods under dim lanterns. The smell of bruised fruit, old vegetables and fish lingered in the air. Rats moved confidently now, darting between crates and barrels. The city belonged to them after dark as much as to anyone. In the East End, streets narrowed and twisted. Buildings pressed closer together, blocking what little light remained. Windows were few, and many were broken or covered. So, uns carried strangely here, bouncing off brick and stone, making distance hard to judge. A cough could seem close when it was far away. Footsteps behind might belong to someone in front. For those without shelter, the night stretched long. The hours between sunset and dawn felt endless, each one heavier than the last. Cold deepened gradually, seeping through fabric and skin until it settled somewhere inside the body. Fatigue blurred the edges of thought. The city demanded alertness even as exhaustion pulled downward, yet London after dark was not entirely cruel. It was indifferent. It continued whether people suffered or not. Bakers began their work long before sunrise, fires already glowing behind shop walls. Coffee sellers prepared their carts in the early hours, sparks jumping from small braziers. The promise of morning existed, even if it was still far away. The night wrapped everything in the same dim light. Rich and poor, housed and unhoused, all moved beneath the same fog and lamps. But their experiences were not shared equally. Some passed through the darkness toward rest. Others remained within it, navigating hour by hour. In 1887, London After Dark revealed the city as it truly was. Not in speeches or newspapers, but in movement, silence and survival. It was a place that did not sleep, and for many could not afford to. In Victorian London, poverty was not always loud or sudden. More often, it arrived quietly. It slipped into a life through small changes that were easy to ignore at first. A missed meal, a late rent payment, a few days of illness that turned into weeks. People did not usually wake up one morning poor. They drifted there, step by step, until the ground beneath them was gone. Many of those who struggled had once lived ordinary lives. They worked steady jobs, paid modest rent, and belonged to neighbourhoods where faces were familiar. Their days followed patterns that felt reliable. Work in the morning, meals at regular hours, sleep in the same room each night. These routines created the feeling of safety, even when money was tight. But Victorian life offered little protection against disruption. Wages were low, and savings rare. A single event could upset everything. A factory slowed production, a dock closed temporarily, a workshop replaced skilled hands with machines. Employment could vanish without warning, and there was often no compensation, no explanation, and no second chance. Illness was especially dangerous. There was no paid leave, no guarantee of returning to work after recovery. A labourer who missed a week could lose his position entirely. A seamstress with an injured hand could no longer earn. Medical care cost money most did not have, and untreated sickness lingered, weakening bodies already stretched thin. Housing was fragile too. Many families lived week to week, paying rent in small amounts. Missing even one payment could lead to eviction. Landlords rarely waited. Rooms were re-rented quickly, and possessions left behind were often lost forever. Once removed from a home, it became difficult to secure another. References mattered, stability mattered. Without them, doors closed quietly. Shame played its own role. People hid their struggles as long as they could. They borrowed small amounts. They sold belongings discreetly. They avoided neighbours who might notice changes. Pride delayed help, and by the time it was set aside, options were fewer. The fall did not feel dramatic, it felt private. Families fractured under pressure. Children were sent to relatives or institutions. Couples separated in search of work. Elderly parents became burdens no one could afford. Each decision was practical, yet each one loosened the ties that had once offered support. Poverty isolated long before it became visible. When work disappeared, days lost structure. Mornings no longer began with purpose. Time stretched unevenly, filled with waiting and searching. Men gathered near docks or factories hoping to be chosen for a few hours' labour. Women walked long distances offering services that paid pennies. Competition was constant. So was rejection. The city offered help, but it came with conditions. Charitable aid was limited and inconsistent. Workhouses promised food and shelter but demanded obedience and separation from family. For many, entering one felt like surrendering identity. People delayed that choice as long as possible, even when alternatives were running out. As resources dwindled, choices narrowed. Meals became smaller and less regular. Clothing wore thin and was rarely replaced. Shoes split at the seams. The body adapted, conserving energy, learning to function on less. Hunger became familiar, not sharp but constant, like background noise. Eventually something shifted. The idea of returning to the previous life began to fade. Days were no longer measured by progress but by endurance. Where once there had been plans, now there were calculations. How long could one stand in a doorway before being moved along? How far a penny could stretch? Which streets felt safer after dark? This was the moment many later described not as becoming poor, but as falling out of ordinary life. The rules changed quietly. Small freedoms disappeared. Sitting too long became suspicious. Resting became risky. The city no longer assumed belonging. What made this fall especially harsh was how invisible it was. Thousands experienced it at the same time, yet each believed it was happening only to them. Newspapers spoke in numbers, not names. Passers-by looked past, not through. The city absorbed loss without pause. Yet even in this slow descent, people remained human. They remembered better days. They spoke of past work with precision and pride. They held on to habits that no longer served a purpose, washing when water was available, polishing shoes that had nowhere to go. These small acts preserved dignity in a world that steadily erased it. falling into poverty in Victorian London was not a single moment of failure. It was a gradual unravelling of stability, choice, and rest. By the time a person reached the streets at night, much had already been lost. What remained was the effort to endure, one evening at a time, within a city that rarely noticed who had slipped through its hands. In Victorian London, poverty was not only a hardship, it was also a suspicion. To lack money, shelter, or visible purpose was to attract attention of a particular kind. The law did not always distinguish clearly between misfortune and wrongdoing. Often, it treated them as the same thing. The streets were governed by rules that valued order above compassion. A person who appeared idle, especially after dark, could be questioned. Standing still for too long invited scrutiny. Sitting or lying down without permission could lead to removal. The city expected movement, and those who could not move with purpose were seen as problems to be managed. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 shaped much of this approach. Written decades earlier, it remained firmly in force by 1887. Under its broad language, anyone without visible means of support could be arrested. Sleeping outdoors, begging, or simply wandering without explanation could all be treated as offences. The law did not require proof of criminal intent. Poverty itself was enough. Police enforcement varied from district to district, but the uncertainty was constant. Some officers were strict, others indifferent, a few quietly sympathetic. Yet for hose on the streets, the difference mattered little. The risk remained. Every encounter carried the possibility of detention, fines, or forced labour. Nights were especially dangerous. Darkness removed the protection of appearing busy. A person resting against a wall could be accused of loitering. Someone curled in a doorway could be charged with obstruction. Even exhaustion had to be hidden. The body was expected to remain upright, alert, and in motion. Arrest did not always mean prison, but it rarely meant relief. Those taken in were often held overnight, their belongings confiscated or lost. In the morning they faced choices that were hardly choices at all: a fine they could not pay, short-term imprisonment, assignment to hard labour. Each option deepened their instability. The workhouse stood as both threat and promise within this system. Officially, it offered shelter, food, and employment. In practice, it demanded obedience, separation from family, and the surrender of autonomy. Conditions were intentionally harsh, designed to discourage reliance. The message was clear: assistance would come at the cost of dignity. Many preferred the streets to that alternative. Freedom, even cold and hungry, felt less crushing than confinement. On the pavements, at least, one could choose where to walk, when to pause, whom to speak to. These small choices mattered deeply to those who had already lost so much. Public attitudes reinforced the law. Poverty was often framed as moral failure. Those without work were assumed to be lazy or dishonest. Newspapers spoke of the poor as a class, not as individuals. Fear of disorder outweighed curiosity about cause. Sympathy was limited and conditional. This mindset shaped the physical city. Benches were designed to discourage lying down, doorways were guarded, public spaces narrowed after dark. The architecture itself enforced movement, ensuring that rest remained a privilege rather than a right. For the poor, this meant learning new rules quickly: where to lean without being noticed, how to sleep standing up, how to wake at the slightest sound of boots on stone. The body adapted not just to hunger and cold, but to vigilance. Rest became shallow and brief, interrupted by fear of discovery. Children were not exempt. Young boys and girls selling small items or carrying messages learned early how to avoid attention. They memorized escape routes, understood which streets were watched more closely, and recognized the tone of an approaching voice. Childhood narrowed under the same pressures as adulthood. The criminalization of poverty did not remove it, it simply pushed it out of sight, forcing it into corners and alleys. Those affected did not disappear. They became quieter, more cautious, less visible during the hours when the city preferred not to see them. Despite this, acts of quiet resistance remained. People shared information about safer routes and sympathetic officers. They warned one another of patrol schedules. EY adapted in ways that preserved a measure of autonomy. Survival became a shared knowledge passed along without ceremony. In this world, legality and morality rarely aligned. To rest was illegal. To beg was suspect. To exist without money was to exist under constant judgment. The law did not ask how someone had fallen so far. It only asked where they were going next. Being poor in Victorian London meant living under rules designed for someone else's comfort. It meant carrying the weight of suspicion with every step, and it meant learning that survival required not only endurance, but the careful avoidance of a system that saw need itself as a crime. As night deepened and the streets grew colder, certain doors began to matter more than others. They were not grand entrances, and they were rarely marked clearly. Often they were tucked into narrow lanes or set beneath faded signs. These doors led to the cheapest form of shelter available in Victorian London. For 1 penny, a person could buy a place inside for the night, not a bed, not even sleep. Just the right to sit. The penny sit-up was exactly what its name suggested. Inside, long wooden benches lined the walls of a bare room. There were no cushions, no backs, no partitions. The benches were smooth from years of use, worn down by bodies that had leaned and shifted through countless nights. The air smelled of damp clothing, stale breath, and old wood. It was not unpleasant so much as heavy, filled with the evidence of exile. Stion. Upon entering, each person paid their penny to an attendant. The exchange was brief and impersonal. Coins were dropped into a box. A nod followed. No names were taken, no questions asked, as long as the penny was produced. Without it, the door remained closed. Once inside, the rules became clear quickly. No lying down, no stretching out, no sleeping in a way that resembled comfort. The benches were designed to enforce posture. Bodies sat shoulder to shoulder, leaning forward or slightly sideways, heads bowed. Any attempt to recline drew attention from the watchful eye of the keeper. The keeper moved slowly through the room, lantern in hand. His presence was steady, predictable, and final. He was not cruel, but he was firm. The shelter existed to maintain order, not to offer relief. If someone slumped too far, he would tap them awake. If someone slid down the bench, they would be told to sit upright again. Time passed strangely in the penny sit-up. Without beds, blankets, or darkness, the night stretched. Gaslight burned continuously, casting a dull glow that never softened. Shadows shifted as people moved, but the room itself did not change. Hours were felt rather than counted. Sleep, when it came, arrived in fragments. A head would drop forward, then lift again. Muscles tightened to keep balance, knees locked, feet pressed firmly into the floor. The body learned to rest in shallow layers, never fully letting go. Dreams were rare, awareness remained close to the surface. Coughing echoed through the room, dry and persistent. So did the occasional muttered word or sigh. Conversation was minimal. People saved their energy. Voices stayed low. Everyone understood that this was not a place for stories or companionship. It was a place to endure. The penny sit-up attracted those who had little left. Men who had worked earlier that day but earned too little for better shelter. Women who avoided the streets but could not afford a bed. Older individuals whose strength no longer allowed them to wander all night. It was a last defence against the cold. Warmth, such as it was, came from proximity. Bodies pressed close, sharing heat unconsciously. Coats were kept on, hats were pulled low. Gloves, if owned, stayed on hands that clenched and unclenched in half-sleep. Despite its severity, the penny sit-up offered something precious: safety. Inside, one was less likely to be arrested, less likely to be moved along, less likely to be rained on or frozen. For many, that small protection justified the discomfort. Morning arrived without ceremony. At a set hour, the keeper's lantern moved through the room more deliberately. People were nudged awake if they had slipped too far into rest. The door opened. Cold air rushed in. One by one, bodies stood stiffly, joints protesting after hours of enforced stillness. Outside, the city waited, unchanged. The penny had been spent. Whatever energy remained would have to carry the person through another day of searching, arcing, or waiting. The penny sit-up was not designed to restore. It was designed to contain. It kept people off the streets, upright and visible, but never comfortable. In its hard benches and sleepless hours, it reflected a system that allowed survival, but only just. The penny sit-up rooms were not built for comfort, but even by their own standards, the crowding was severe. A single room might hold 60 men, sometimes more, all pressed into a space that felt too small even before it filled. The walls closed in once the door shut, and the air thickened almost immediately. Benches ran along every available surface. Where there were gaps, extra stools were pushed in. There was no personal space. Knees touched, elbows overlapped, coats brushed against faces. Every movement required awareness of others, a careful adjustment to avoid conflict or discomfort. Privacy vanished the moment one stepped inside. The room carried its own sound, not loud, but constant. Breathing layered upon breathing. Coughs rose and fell like distant waves. An occasional throat cleared. Someone shifted their weight, causing a chain reaction as others adjusted. The wood beneath creaked softly, responding to the strain. Smell was unavoidable. Wet wool, unwashed bodies, old tobacco, and the sharp trace of cheap spirits blended together. It was not the smell of neglect, but of lives lived outdoors and indoors without relief. Over time, the senses dulled. What first seemed overwhelming became background. Far. CES were lit unevenly by gaslight. Deep lines showed in older men's skin. Younger faces carried the same tired expressions, carved early by long hours and hard labour. Eyes stayed mostly downcast. Meeting another's gaze felt unnecessary, even intrusive. Conversation was rare and brief, a whispered request to shift slightly, a quiet apology when a foot was stepped on. Words were used sparingly, as if saving them mattered. Silence was easier to maintain than connection in such close quarters. Yet within this silence, awareness remained sharp. People learned quickly who snored, who twitched in half-sleep, who might slump too far forward. Everyone adjusted to everyone else. Survival in the room depended on mutual restraint. There were unspoken rules: do not take more space than you are given. Do not complain aloud. Do not draw attention. These rules were enforced not by the keeper, but by collective understanding. Anyone who disrupted the fragile balance risked removal. For many, this room represented the narrowest margin between shelter and exposure. Each man carried his own story, though few were shared. Former dock workers, clerks fallen from steady employment, soldiers too old for service, migrants newly arrived and already struggling. Their lives converged here, reduced to bodies occupying space. Time passed slowly. Without darkness, the body resisted sleep. Muscles tightened from holding position. Legs tingled as circulation slowed. Every few minutes, someone shifted, testing the limits of endurance. Despite the hardship, there was a strange order to it all. The room functioned because everyone accepted its constraints. 60 men endured together, not through camaraderie, but through quiet cooperation. When morning came, the room emptied as efficiently as it had filled. No goodbyes were exchanged. Each man stepped back into the street carrying the same burden he had brought in, minus 1 penny and a few hours of shallow rest. In that crowded room, individuality blurred. What remained was the shared effort to endure a night without falling. In places like the penny sit-up, sleep was not something that happened naturally. It had to be learned, reshaped, and controlled. The body, denied the comfort of lying down, adapted slowly. Rest became a skill rather than a state. At first, exhaustion fought against awareness. Muscles trembled, heads nodded, and balance wavered. Many newcomers struggled through their first nights, jerking awake repeatedly as their bodies attempted to fall into deeper sleep. The benches punished these moments with stiffness and pain. Falling too far forward or sideways drew a sharp reminder from the keeper or from the bench itself. Over time, patterns emerged. People discovered positions that allowed brief relief, leaning forward with forearms resting on thighs, crossing ankles to steady the lower body, tucking the chin just enough to release the neck without fully slumping. These small adjustments mattered. They determined whether the night was survivable or unbearable. Breathing changed too. Slow, shallow breaths helped maintain balance. Deep breathing risked relaxation, and relaxation risked collapse. The body stayed partially alert, guarding itself even while resting. Sleep, when it came, was thin and fleeting, like a ripple on the surface of consciousness. The mind adapted alongside the body. Thoughts shortened, memories softened at the edges. People learned not to think too far ahead. Planning drained energy that was better saved. The focus narrowed to the present moment, to the steady rhythm of breathing and the simple goal of remaining upright. Time fractured. Minutes felt long. Hours felt uncertain. Without darkness or clocks, the night lost structure. The body measured time by discomfort rather than by numbers. A stiff knee marked 1 hour. A numb foot marked another. Dreams, if they appeared at all, were brief and fragmented. Images surfaced without context and vanished just as quickly. There was no deep descent into rest, no surrender. Awareness hovered close, ready to respond to movement, sound, or instruction. This half-rest took a toll. Mornings arrived with bodies that felt older than they were. Muscles ached as if from heavy labour. Joints resisted movement. Yet people stood, adjusted their coats, and stepped outside. They had learned to function without true sleep. Those who survived longest developed a quiet mastery. They could rest their minds while keeping their bodies rigid. They could drift without falling. This skill was passed indirectly, observed rather than taught. Watching others provided instruction. A glance at how someone positioned their feet or leaned their shoulders offered clues. Fatigue became constant, but it also became familiar. The body recalibrated its expectations. What once felt unbearable became ordinary. This was not resilience in the heroic sense, but in the practical one, the kind born of necessity. There were costs that went unseen. Concentration suffered, tempers shortened, illness took hold more easily. Yet within the system these effects were invisible. The city measured success by survival, not by health. Learning to rest without sleeping allowed people to endure nights that would otherwise have broken them. It was an adaptation shaped by scarcity and control. In those dim rooms, rest was never complete, but it was enough to carry a person forward into another day. When morning light filtered through the fog, the city did not pause to recover. It began again immediately. For those without steady work, the streets themselves became a place of trade. Not a single market, but many small ones, scattered and fragile, built from opportunity and chance. Money moved in tiny amounts. Pennies changed hands quietly, often without words. A man might earn one by holding a horse's reins while its owner stepped inside a shop. Another might carry a crate from one end of the street to the other. These tasks lasted minutes, sometimes NDS, but they were enough to keep going. Location mattered. Certain corners offered better chances than others. Outside busy public houses, near markets as they opened, close to railway arches where deliveries arrived early. Knowledge of these places spread by observation. People returned to the same spots, hoping familiarity might bring recognition and trust. Work was never guaranteed. 10 men might wait for one opportunity. Most would leave empty-handed. Rejection was constant but rarely spoken of. People learned to ask without appearing desperate, to stand close enough to be seen but not so close as to be threatening. Women often found different forms of work, washing clothes, mending garments, cleaning doorsteps, selling small items like matches or flowers. These tasks paid little, but they allowed some control over time and movement. Children joined in, contributing what they could, learning the rhythms of street life early. Barter filled the gaps where money could not. A scrap of bread exchanged for a favour, a place near a warm vent shared for information. Knowledge itself became currency, knowing which baker discarded day-old loaves, which market stall left trimmings behind, which doorways were watched less closely. The streets rewarded attentiveness. A dropped coin noticed before others saw it, a customer hesitating just long enough to be offered help. Survival depended on watching, listening, and responding quickly. These small economies were unstable. Rain reduced. Foot traffic. Illness removed strength. Police attention disrupted familiar patterns. Each day required adjustment. Yesterday's strategy might fail without warning. Despite this, there was a sense of order. People respected one another's chosen spots. Taking another's place without cause could lead to quiet conflict. Boundaries existed, enforced not by law but by shared understanding. Earnings were spent quickly. Food came first, shelter next. Little remained. Saving was rare and difficult. A single misstep could erase progress made over weeks. Yet within these narrow margins, people maintained pride. They worked when work was available. They contributed when they could. These small economies offered more than money. They offered purpose, however limited, in a city that measured worth by movement and utility. The street was harsh, but it was also alive with effort. Each penny earned carried the weight of intention. Survival was not passive. It was negotiated, moment by moment, on stone and pavement. In Victorian London, hunger was not always loud or dramatic. It did not always announce itself with cries or complaints. More often, It lingered quietly, threading through every day and night, shaping thoughts, movements, and even dreams. For those who lived without stability, it became a constant companion, one that could never be fully satisfied. Mornings often began with empty stomachs. People rose from the benches of shelters or the streets themselves with a dull ache in the belly, familiar and unrelenting. Sometimes a piece of bread or a stale pastry could be found. Other times nothing at all appeared until later in the day. Each moment of waiting stretched the senses, making the air feel heavier, the streets longer. Hunger affected more than just the body. It shaped decisions, limited risk-taking, and sharpened observation. The person with an empty stomach could not afford to waste energy on conversation or leisure. Every step, every glance, every choice about where to go and what to touch carried the weight of survival. Food was a currency of safety, not comfort. People scavenged whenever possible. Markets, even after closing, offered remnants, bruised vegetables, day-old bread, discarded scraps. Bakers sometimes left behind what they could not sell, but this was inconsistent, unpredictable. Hunger forced quick thinking. It forced people to remember exactly which streets offered opportunity, which shopkeepers tolerated a pleading glance, and which corners were empty of oversight. Those who worked for pennies faced a cruel equation. Work earned coins, but by the time food was purchased, the body often had endured hours of empty stomachs, weakened limbs, and a mind clouded with fatigue. Eating became a task of necessity, not enjoyment. Meals were small, hurried, and often repetitive: bread, thin gruel, or the smallest scraps of meat. Each bite offered relief, but never enough to erase the lingering emptiness. Children were not spared. They led to manage hunger almost instinctively. Their smaller bodies required less, but the sensation of emptiness taught lessons quickly. They adapted to portions that would seem unbearable to adults. They shared what little they had without argument because survival depended on careful cooperation. Hunger also shaped community. People noticed others who were weaker, slower, or too ill to work. Some offered crumbs, shared scraps, or whispered tips about where bread could be found. These acts were quiet, subtle, and uncelebrated, yet they carried life-saving importance. Survival depended not just on one's own vigilance, but on knowing who could be trusted in moments of need. Even with food, hunger never fully vanished. It left a residue in the mind, a constant awareness of scarcity. It made people careful with movement, cautious with conversation, and alert to every passing opportunity. The body adapted, learning to conserve energy, to endure long hours without the nourishment most would consider essential. This adaptation was quiet and relentless. At night, the absence of food was felt most keenly. Shelters provided warmth, a bench to sit, and a roof overhead, but no satisfaction for the appetite. The stomach gnawed, reminding the occupant that another day of searching, scavenging, or begging awaited. Sleep itself was thin, shallow, and restless because the mind and body could not fully relax when hunger persisted. Hunger in Victorian London was more than physical need. It was a condition that shaped entire routines. It determined where people went, when they moved, and what risks they took. It infiltrated thoughts and limited dreams. Even a full meal could not erase the memory of emptiness. Hunger was in many ways a permanent companion, an invisible weight carried silently by those who had no choice but to endure it. Yet even in this harshness, life continued. People adapted. They moved with awareness. They scavenged with efficiency. They shared when possible. Hunger remained, always present, but it did not break the body completely. It shaped resilience, sharpened observation, and demanded endurance. In the quiet ache of an empty stomach, survival learned its own rhythm, one that carried on until the next moment of small relief. In the quiet hierarchy of Victorian shelters, a small difference in cost could mean a very different kind of night. For 1 penny, a person could claim a seat on a bench, upright and alert, barely allowed to rest. For 2 pennies, a new option appeared: the rope. It was not a bed, nor a guarantee of deep sleep, but it offered something rare, partial relief from the rigid, punishing upright posture. The rope stretched taut across the room, anchored to walls or posts above the benches. Its purpose was simple: to allow bodies to lean, partially supported, without collapsing entirely. A man or woman could rest for moments longer than the penny sit-up allowed, easing the strain on legs and spine. It was a small luxury, bought at twice the usual cost, but for those who could afford it, the difference was profound. The room itself smelled of wood, smoke, and human presence, thickened now by bodies leaning and pressing against one another. Each rope carried the weight of multiple people, swaying subtly with the slow rhythm of shallow rest. Shadows flickered under the soft glow of gas lamps, and the entire space seemed to breathe in unison with its occupants. The process of claiming a rope was quiet and orderly. One dropped 2 pennies into the collection box, exchanged a nod with the attendant, and moved to a space beneath the line. Learning to use it effectively required care. Lean too far, and balance would fail. Shift the weight incorrectly, and the rope would wobble unexpectedly, disturbing nearby sleepers. Observation and precision became part of the night's skill. For many, this rope represented more than physical support. It was a small reprieve from the relentless discipline of survival. Leaning slightly back or forward allowed muscles to relax in a way benches did not. Head and shoulders could rest for brief stretches, and the body could conserve energy in preparation for the day ahead. It was a subtle comfort, almost imperceptible but deeply significant to those who had endured long nights before. Even with this support, sleep remained shallow. The body adapted again, half alert and cautious. Leaning on the rope did not mean surrendering completely. Hands gripped lightly, feet pressed for balance. Any sound, boots, coughs, shifting wood, could wake the sleeper instantly. Rest was measured in minutes, not hours. Every movement mattered, every adjustment was deliberate. Despite the strain, the rope allowed people to survive longer in these harsh conditions. Each moment of semi-rest restored strength. Slowly, muscles that would otherwise ache from hours upright found small relief. Fatigue became more manageable, and the mind could relax just enough to remain functional. The rope did not bring comfort in the modern sense, but it brought endurance. Silence dominated the room, punctuated by small, necessary noises, coughs, soft movements, whispered adjustments of clothing. Occasionally a quiet word passed between neighbours, but conversations were rare. Everyone understood that space and time were precious. Even minimal disturbances could ripple across the line, disturbing multiple people. The 2-penny rope also introduced a subtle hierarchy within the room. Those who could pay had a slight advantage. They were able to rest more effectively, conserve more energy, and approach the coming day with slightly more resilience. It was a reminder that survival in Victorian London was often measured in the smallest of differences. A single penny could decide whether the night was endured upright or partially eased by the rope's support. When morning arrived, the ropes were released, and occupants straightened slowly, stiff from hours of constrained positions. The pennies had bought more than access. They had bought brief comfort, however incomplete. The city outside awaited, unchanged, with another day of movement, work, and vigilance. In the rope rooms, people learned subtle mastery of their own bodies, the limits of support, and the endurance of discomfort. The rope was neither a bed nor a luxury. It was a lifeline, one that allowed the night to pass with slightly less suffering. For those who grasped it, it represented survival measured not just in hours awake, but in the precious, fleeting moments of rest that made the next day possible. In the crowded rooms of Victorian shelters, the rope was more than a simple support. It became a makeshift bed for those who had learned to use it wisely. At first glance, it might seem uncomfortable, even cruel. Yet for those who understood its purpose, it offered something rare, a way to rest without lying fully on a bench, a chance to let the body release tension without surrendering entirely to sleep. The rope was stretched tightly across the room, anchored at points carefully measured to bear weight. Leaning against it required balance and attention, but with practice it allowed the body to relax in ways benches could not. A torso could tilt forward slightly, arms resting along its length, head supported by forearms or a folded coat. Legs remained partially bent, feet planted on the floor to maintain stability. Each movement was deliberate, each shift measured. Over time, people discovered that small adjustments made a large difference. Shifting weight from one foot to the other relieved numbness. Hugging a coat or bundle provided cushion against the rough rope. Some leaned into a neighbour, sharing warmth in silent cooperation. The rope became more than wood and fibre. It became a temporary home for bodies other. Eyes unsupported. The air in the room carried the mixture of effort and rest. Damp wool, dust from worn clothing, and the faint tang of coal smoke blended together. Breathing rose and fell in unison, a quiet rhythm of human survival. Shadows from the gas lamps danced across walls, stretching over faces that were pale, tired, and focused entirely on the act of staying upright while letting muscles soften. Sleep remained fragmented. Few sank into deep unconsciousness. The body rested enough to regain small amounts of energy, while the mind hovered near awareness, ready to respond to sound or touch. It was a delicate balance, rest that was never complete, sleep that was only partial. Yet it allowed endurance. For many, the rope became an intimate teacher. It taught the limits of what a body could endure while partially supported. It showed how muscles could release tension without fully letting go. It demanded precision, leaning too far, gripping too lightly, or shifting abruptly could send one falling or disturb neighbours. The rope required attention, yet in return it offered the most effective rest available in the shelter. This improvisation transformed nights into something more manageable. Where once the benches punished posture and prevented comfort, the rope allowed a small reprieve. Arms could relax, shoulders could sink slightly, and muscles fatigued from days of labour could regain strength. It was still far from a proper bed, yet it became as close as circumstances owed. People developed routines around the rope. Some arrived early to claim a favoured spot where the rope was more stable or easier to lean against. Some brought cloth or scraps to soften the pressure. Others positioned themselves to avoid drafts or sudden disturbance. These small rituals carried the weight of necessity, but also the dignity of choice within a limited world. Morning came quietly, as it always did. Occupants released their grip, stretched stiffened limbs, and prepared to leave. The rope returned to its taut, empty state, waiting for the next evening's arrivals. In the brief hours of darkness, it had served as a lifeline, a temporary relief, and for a few moments, a bed. In this way, the rope became more than its simple materials. It became a tool of survival, a solution to impossible conditions, and a quiet testament to human adaptability. For those who relied on it, it was proof that even in discomfort there could be small reprieves, rest shaped not by comfort, but by necessity, skill, and endurance. In the harsh reality of Victorian shelters, standing became an unexpected skill. When benches were full, or when pennies could not stretch to a rope, the only option left was upright rest. Sleeping while standing was neither easy nor natural, yet for those forced to endure it, it became a quiet art of survival. The first lesson was balance. Leaning too far forward or backward meant falling and drawing attention. Feet had to be positioned firmly, slightly apart, to provide a stable base. Knees remained slightly bent to absorb fatigue. Shoulders relaxed just enough to avoid tension without surrendering to collapse. Even the slightest miscalculation could result in injury or disturbance of those around. Hands often played a role in this delicate practice. Some rested them on nearby benches, poles, or walls. Others folded them over bundles of clothing or coats. A simple touch, a firm grip, became a lifeline. The body adapted slowly, learning to let certain muscles release tension while others held steady. Every movement had to be conscious, though over time it became almost instinctive. Breathing became subtle, shallow, and measured. Deep breaths threatened imbalance. Rapid breathing reflected nerves or fatigue. People learned to coordinate each inhalation with a gentle shift of weight, a micro-adjustment of stance. Even in moments of half-rest, the body remained prepared to react to noise, light, or unexpected movement. The space around mattered. Standing too close to others risked collision. Too far, and warmth from nearby bodies could not be shared. Those who mastered the skill found their place among the standing figures, a quiet rhythm forming in the group. Each person's slight sway, each shifting weight, became part of a collective pattern. Survival here was as much about observation as endurance. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched and contracted, measured not by clocks but by sensations. Feet ached in slow waves, legs stiffened, muscles trembled. Yet the mind learned to ignore these signals while maintaining vigilance. The body discovered how to rest without ever fully relaxing, how to conserve strength while remaining upright. This skill often passed by watching others. A newcomer learned to lean slightly into a wall without disturbing those nearby. They observed how the older, more experienced individuals shifted weight, distributed pressure, and balanced fatigue. The practice spread quietly, silently, forming a community of bodies standing together, each aware of the other. Even in this position, sleep arrived in fleeting fragments. Nodding heads, brief lapses of awareness, tiny moments of muscle release. No one could fall deeply, no one could surrender entirely. Yet these tiny intervals of rest were enough to sustain life through the night. By morning the body was stiff and sore, but the mind and will remained intact. Standing to sleep was not simply physical, it was also psychological. It taught vigilance, patience, and adaptability. It proved that even in constrained, uncomfortable, and harsh conditions, survival could be maintained. Those who mastered the skill carried it with them, ready for any night where benches, ropes, or pennies were insufficient. In Victorian London, standing while sleeping became more than necessity. It was a lesson in endurance, a quiet demonstration of the body's capacity to adapt, and a testament to the resilience of those who had no choice but to bend their lie. There's to the rhythm of survival. Morning in the rope shelters did not arrive gently. There was no gradual easing into wakefulness, no soft signal that the night had ended. Instead, the end came suddenly, delivered by a simple, practical action that everyone understood without explanation. As the hour approached, the room shifted. Bodies stirred before they were fully awake. Muscles tensed instinctively. Even in half-sleep, people sensed that rest was about to end. The air felt different, charged with expectation rather than fatigue. Breath quickened. Hands tightened their grip. The attendant moved quietly along the length of the room. He carried no lantern now, only a small knife, its blade worn smooth from repeated use. There was no anger in his movements, no cruelty. This was procedure, repeated every morning, the final act of the night's arrangement. The rope had held dozens of bodies through hours of shallow rest. It had bent slightly under their weight, fibers stretched and warmed by human presence. Now it was about to be released. With a firm, practiced motion, the attendant cut the rope. The effect was immediate. Without the support they had leaned against, bodies tipped forward in unison. Some stumbled, catching themselves on benches or the floor. Others lurched a step ahead, boots scraping against wood. A few fell fully forward, absorbing the shock with stiff arms and tired legs. There were no cries of surprise. Everyone expected it. This was how mornings worked here. The knife did not just cut rope, it ended the night. Sleep vanished instantly. The body had no time to resist waking. Muscles snapped into alertness, driven by the need to regain balance. Any lingering dreams dissolved under the sharp demand to stay upright. For a brief moment, the room filled with movement. People straightened coats, adjusted hats, shook feeling back into numb arms. Coughs returned, deeper now, echoing off the walls. Someone muttered under their breath, more out of habit than complaint. The rope lay slack on the floor, no longer useful. Its work was done. This abrupt waking served a purpose. It ensured no one lingered. No one could pretend to sleep longer. The shelter was not a place for rest beyond what had already been taken. The day was waiting and the room had to be cleared. There was no anger directed at the attendant. He was not seen as the cause of discomfort. He was part of the system, as fixed as the benches and walls. The knife was simply the signal that the agreement had ended. People moved with stiff efficiency. Those who had slept against the rope felt the strain in their backs and shoulders as they straightened fully. The brief relief the rope had provided was already fading, replaced by the familiar ache of fatigue. Outside, the cold air rushed in as the door opened. The contrast was sharp. Inside, the room had been crowded and heavy with warmth. Outside, the street felt vast and exposed. Breath appeared in pale clouds once again. Stepping, tea. After waking by the knife carried a particular feeling. There was no sense of having rested properly, yet there was also relief. The night, with its tension and careful balancing, was over. Whatever the day demanded would be different, even if it was just as difficult. Some paused just beyond the doorway, gathering themselves before moving on. Others walked away immediately, drawn by habit toward familiar streets and corners. No one looked back. The shelter faded behind them, already resetting for the next evening. The memory of waking by the knife lingered in the body. Sudden movements during the day brought echoes of that forward lurch. Muscles remained guarded, ready to react. Even in daylight, the body remembered that rest could be taken away without warning. Yet there was also gratitude, quiet and unspoken. The rope had allowed rest that would not have been possible otherwise. The knife ended it, but it did not erase what had been gained. A few hours of partial relief could mean the difference between collapse and endurance. In Victorian London, mornings did not begin with choice for those at the bottom. They began with necessity. Waking by the knife was not an act of punishment. It was a reminder of the boundaries of survival, clearly drawn and firmly enforced. The rope was never meant to last. Neither was the night. And when the blade fell, life moved forward again, carried on stiff legs and tired bodies, into another day shaped by the same quiet struggle to endure. In the streets of Victorian London, survival was not an accident. It was a skill built step by step, learned over time, and sharpened by necessity. Those who endured the harsh nights, the penny sit-ups, the ropes and the standing hours, understood the city as a ladder. Each rung represented knowledge, experience, and small victories that allowed one to keep going, one day at a time. The lowest rung was simply showing up, arriving at shelters before nightfall, claiming a place on a bench or a rope, or finding a doorway that offered minimal protection. Many failed here, arriving too late, too tired, or too unfamiliar with the rules. Survival began with timing and awareness, the understanding that the first step must always be present. The next rung was endurance. This was learned through repeated nights of minimal comfort. Legs ached, shoulders stiffened, stomachs grumbled, yet bodies adapted. Those who could endure without complaint, who managed their discomfort silently, climbed higher on the ladder. Fatigue became a teacher, instructing them on how to conserve energy, how to adjust posture, how to rest without fully relaxing. Observation formed another rung. The streets and shelters were classrooms, watching who got chosen for work, noticing where scraps of food appeared, and learning which corners were safest after dark all became invaluable skills. Those who paid attention moved more efficiently through the city's dangers, avoiding both trouble and wasted effort. Knowledge became currency, often more valuable than a penny. The next step was economy. Small coins, food scraps, and favours were the currency of survival. A penny could buy a bench, 2 could buy a rope, half a loaf of bread could stave off hunger for a day. Trade, barter, and careful calculation dictated every move. Those who learned to stretch resources without drawing attention gained security, even if temporary. Relationships formed another rung, subtle and cautious. Trust was rare but necessary. A word of warning from someone familiar, a shared scrap of bread, or a tip about a safer corner could mean the difference between danger and temporary relief. Bonds were formed quietly, without ceremony, but their value was immense. The ladder rose higher for those who could navigate not only the streets but the people who moved within them. The top rungs required foresight, understanding when to move, when to beg, when to work, and when to rest meant balancing risk against necessity. Decisions had consequences that were immediate and visible. One wrong step, choosing the wrong corner, asking at the wrong shop, leaning too far on a rope, could cost coins, comfort, or even dignity. Those who mastered these calculations moved with quiet confidence, appearing almost invisible in their efficiency. Yet the ladder of survival was not linear. Even the most experienced could fall. Illness, bad weather, or an uncooperative employer could force someone back down. The city did not forgive mistakes, no. Did it wait for recovery. Climbing required persistence and adaptation. Every fall demanded that lessons be remembered, that skills be refined. Children learned the ladder from observation, absorbing lessons silently from adults who had already survived countless nights. They memorized routes, recognized patterns in behavior, and understood where opportunity lay hidden among risk. The skills were practical, not theoretical. The ladder was never about luxury or comfort. It was about enduring another day, another night, another challenge. For those who understood it, the ladder offered more than survival. It offered a sense of mastery over an unpredictable world. Each rung climbed reinforced the possibility of continuation. Even when exhaustion pressed heavily, even when hunger persisted, even when danger seemed near, each step achieved was proof that life could be managed, even if only moment by moment. In Victorian London, the ladder of survival was invisible to most, yet tangible to those who lived it. It was built on awareness, endurance, small economies, relationships, and foresight. It was climbed quietly, with effort and patience, rung by rung, until the city's harshness could be endured another night. Those who ascended it did so not through privilege, but through careful learning, observation, and the relentless will to live. In the alleys and narrow streets of Victorian London, the workhouse was more than a building. It was a looming presence, a shadow that stretched across the lives of those living in poverty. Its walls were stark, cold, and unwelcoming. To some, it promised food and shelter. To others, it promised humiliation, separation, and a loss of dignity. For those scraping by on pennies and ropes, its existence hung over every decision, every night, and every coin earned. The workhouse was designed to discourage reliance. Meals were basic, often thin gruel or bread. Beds were shared, blankets sparse, and privacy almost non-existent. Families could be split apart. Men separated from women, parents separated from children, all in the name of efficiency and moral instruction. It was a place where survival came at a cost far greater than hunger, autonomy. People on the streets learned to weigh the shadow carefully. Entering the workhouse meant safety from the elements, protection from police scrutiny, and a full stomach for the night. But it also meant obedience. Every movement, every behavior was monitored. Rules were strict, leaving little room for error. The workhouse demanded submission. It demanded that individuality be surrendered. Outside, the shadow influenced the streets. Those who could avoid the workhouse did so. They mastered the penny sit-ups, the ropes, the standing positions, and the careful economies of the street because freedom, even in hardship, was preferable to confinement. The knowledge of what awaited inside shaped strategies for survival, encouraging careful planning, cautious movement, and the subtle negotiation. Of each day's risks, children learned about the workhouse early. Its reputation reached even the youngest ears. To be sent, there was to be marked, removed from family and familiar surroundings. Parents whispered warnings, and older siblings watched the fates of others with caution. The fear was quiet, yet deeply internalized. It guided decisions in ways that were invisible to outsiders but deeply felt by those on the streets. The workhouse shadow also shaped behavior among neighbors. People avoided drawing attention, spoke quietly, and obeyed the rules of public spaces carefully. Standing too long in one place, asking too boldly for coins, or appearing too tired could invite the intervention of authorities, who might see the workhouse as the next step. The shadow was not just a building, it was a system of control, a moral and social boundary. For some, the workhouse became inevitable. Illness, lost work, or injury left no choice. Those who entered did so quietly, their dignity intact as best they could maintain it. They followed rules and endured discomfort, often relying on small acts of kindness between inmates to sustain morale. Despite its harshness, the workhouse could offer a temporary reprieve from the relentless hunger and exposure of the streets. Yet the shadow never truly disappeared. Even after leaving the building, its memory lingered. Those who had been inside understood the limits of security and comfort. The lessons carried forward: survive quietly, manage resources carefully, and keep autonomy wherever possible. The workhouse shaped not just nights inside its walls, but decisions made on every street outside. In this way, the shadow became part of survival itself. It influenced where people went, how they moved, and how they spent their pennies. It was a constant reminder of the boundaries imposed by society, a presence that weighed on every step of daily life. To endure Victorian London without succumbing to the workhouse required skill, observation, and an almost unspoken knowledge of limits. The workhouse was a symbol, a warning, and occasionally a necessity. Its shadow stretched beyond its doors, touching every bench, rope, and doorway in the city. For those who had learned to survive in its periphery, it was not just a building, but a measure of how precarious life truly was, and how fragile the balance between endurance and surrender could be. Victorian London was unforgiving to those without shelter, warmth, or steady food. For the poorest, the combination of illness and cold became a constant threat, quietly claiming lives in ways that often went unnoticed. The streets were a battlefield of survival, and the winter air was as much an enemy as hunger or the relentless demands of work. Colds, fevers, and respiratory ailments were rampant. Without access to proper medicine or doctors, even minor illnesses could escalate quickly. A simple cough, left untreated, could weaken the body to the point that standing, walking, or maintaining balance became impossible. Fever drained energy, leaving the sick person unable to earn the pennies necessary for food or shelter. Each day became a struggle against both the illness and the exposure it brought. Cold was another merciless adversary. Winters in London were damp and chilling, the wind slipping through narrow streets and doorways. Water dripped from gutters onto coats and clothing, soaking through layers meant to keep warmth at bay. Bodies learned to curl tightly, share heat with neighbours, and move constantly to stave off numbness, but even these strategies were only partially effective. Shivering became a way of life, a constant reminder that the body required warmth or risked injury, sickness, or worse. For many, the combination of cold and illness was deadly. Those who were already weakened by hunger, overwork, or exhaustion found it impossible to recover. They disappeared quietly, sometimes taken away by authorities, sometimes found too late on a bench or under a doorway. Families and communities were fragmented by these losses. Names and faces vanished, leaving only whispers and empty spaces where lives had been. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their smaller bodies required more warmth, more nourishment, and more care than they often received. Illness spread quickly among them, and the lack of protection or consistent meals made survival tenuous. Parents could only do so much, often sacrificing their own comfort for the child, yet even those efforts could not always prevent tragedy. Even the workhouse, with its strict rules and harsh conditions, could not guarantee safety. While it provided shelter and food, overcrowding and poor sanitation sometimes worsened the spread of disease. The same cold that drove people indoors also lingered in drafty rooms, and those too weak to keep up with workhouse routines often suffered quietly. The streets themselves became graveyards of impermanence. Lives ended without notice, without record, and without ceremony. People learned to navigate these risks with careful observation. They noticed who seemed weakest, who shivered most, who coughed persistently. Sometimes quiet interventions, a shared coat, a piece of bread, a warm corner, could save a life, if only temporarily. Survival under these conditions demanded vigilance at every moment. One had to balance exposure with movement, food with energy, work with rest. A single misstep could mean illness, and illness could mean disappearance. The city's harshness was a constant teacher, shaping behavior, relationships, and the choices people made every day. Yet even in this shadowed reality, life persisted. People adapted to illness and cold with routines and strategies. Bundles of clothing were layered with precision. Feet, hands, and heads were guarded from drafts. Food was rationed to provide maximum sustenance. The body learned resilience, and the mind learned focus, cultivating strategies to survive in a world that did not fork. I've weakness. Illness, cold, and disappearing lives were part of the rhythm of existence for London's poorest. They were silent threats, shaping behaviour, limiting choices, and demanding constant attention. Those who endured learned to measure each step, each breath, each moment of rest, understanding that survival was a fragile balance between endurance, adaptation, and luck. In the midst of hardship, the smallest victories, an uninterrupted night, a full stomach, a warm day, were celebrated quietly within the mind. Every moment survived was a triumph, a defiance against the cold, against disease, and against the invisibility that threatened to erase them entirely. Survival was never certain, but it was always fought for, minute by minute, in the shadow of illness and cold, in the shadowed streets and crowded shelters of Victorian London. Acts of kindness were rare and often quiet, almost imperceptible. They left little mark on the world outside, and yet for those who received them, they could mean the difference between enduring the night and surrendering to exhaustion or despair. In a city built on scarcity and survival, kindness existed only in small, almost invisible gestures. A loaf of bread shared without a word, a coat passed over trembling shoulders, a small corner of warmth offered to a child or elderly neighbour. These acts were discreet because resources were limited. Giving away what little one had was a risk. To survive, one had to balance generosity with necessity, offering only what could be spared without threatening one's own endurance. People learned to notice these gestures quickly. A flicker of attention, a gentle touch, a coin dropped unnoticed into a palm, all were signals of care in a world where loud displays were dangerous or impractical. Recipients often registered them only after the fact, aware of the warmth or relief that came in that fleeting moment. Sometimes the giver left before the acknowledgement could even occur. Kindness was rarely reciprocated immediately. Those living on the edge had little to give in return. Yet its effects lingered in the body and mind. The warmth of a shared blanket could ease shivering for hours. The taste of bread could carry someone through the day. The quiet assurance that another human had noticed their struggle just enough to intervene could restore a fragment of hope. Even small conversations could act as kindness. A whispered warning about a patrol officer, a quiet tip about where to find water, a suggestion of a safe corner to rest. These words, though brief and matter-of-fact, helped people navigate the city's dangers. They did not change the system, but they offered temporary guidance, a lifeline, in an environment where guidance was scarce. Children observed this carefully. They absorbed lessons in subtle empathy, understanding that kindness was most effective when discreet. A gentle gesture could create safety without inviting danger, while too much attention could provoke scion, or conflict. They learned to register small acts quietly, holding on to them for comfort rather than boasting of them. The shelters themselves encouraged subtlety. Space was limited, bodies were crowded, and the rules demanded quiet endurance. Kindness had to fit into these constraints. A coat could be draped across shoulders without a word. A few crumbs could be slipped under a blanket. Hands clasped briefly in support. Every act was measured, careful, almost invisible. Even in this quietness, the effects were profound. People survived the night with less fear, slightly less hunger, and just enough warmth to endure the day ahead. Kindness, though barely noticed, created threads of connection between strangers. In an environment defined by scarcity and hardship, these threads were fragile but vital. Most acts went unrecorded, unnoticed by the world beyond the streets. There were no stories, no recognition, no reward. Yet for the people who lived through them, they mattered deeply. They reminded individuals that, even in the harshest conditions, humanity persisted. Compassion could exist even where it was almost invisible. In the silent exchange of care, people learned resilience. They learned to give, to receive, and to hold on to small gestures as sustenance for the spirit. In Victorian London, where survival was measured in pennies and endurance, kindness that barely registers was often the quietest, and sometimes the most powerful tool to endure the night and face a noth. A day, in the final hours of night, when the streets of Victorian London were cloaked in fog and frost, survival was no longer a choice, it was the only goal. Hunger, cold, exhaustion, and the constant risk of exposure left no space for dreams, ambitions, or leisure. Every thought, every movement, every breath was measured against one single question: how to make it through until morning. By this stage, the body and mind had adapted to endure extreme conditions. Muscles ached constantly, joints stiffened, and stomachs burned with hunger that could never be fully satisfied. The mind, however, sharpened in ways that were both necessary and unnatural. Decisions had to be immediate: which street offered warmth, which shop might discard a scrap of bread, which alley provided shelter from the wind. Each choice carried consequences that were immediate and visible. The shelters, ropes, and penny sit-ups were no longer conveniences. They were essential tools in a nightly battle for life. The benches were hard, the ropes taut, the standing positions demanding. There was no comfort, no indulgence, only techniques honed over countless nights to preserve what little strength remained. Sleep became a fragmented, shallow state, pursued not for pleasure but for the sheer ability to continue functioning. Hunger dominated every plan. Even when food was found, it was rationed carefully, chewed slowly, and saved for critical moments. One bite might sustain warmth or energy for hours, one miscalculation could result in fatigue so severe that the body could no longer move efficiently. The calculus of hunger dictated the day's movement, the allocation of pennies, and the willingness to risk exposure. Cold was an ever-present adversary, reminding everyone that survival was finite. Wet clothing, wind-driven rain, or damp alleys could sap strength in minutes. People learned to conserve body heat through layering, huddling together, and deliberate motion. Every step was an exercise in endurance. Even small lapses, shivering too long, staying in one place too still, could have consequences. Relationships, kindness, and comfort became secondary, nearly forgotten. Sharing a blanket or food was no longer a common act. It could endanger the giver as much as it aided the recipient. The city demanded that individuals prioritize themselves above all else. Trust was rare. Every person's movements were watched, not only for danger but for competition. Survival had become a solitary, almost mechanical focus. In the shadows of this relentless struggle, the mind began to simplify. Thoughts narrowed to essentials: where to go, what to eat, how to rest, how to avoid danger. Memory of past pleasures, hopes for the future, or fleeting joys of companionship faded into the background. Life became a series of calculated steps, each one designed to prolong existence just long enough to reach the next moment. Children, who had once played quietly in corners or scavenged with curiosity, now mirror. Adult focus. Their energy was directed toward movement, toward securing small necessities, toward endurance. Play, laughter, and distraction were luxuries that had vanished. Survival shaped not only actions, but identity itself. Even when shelter was found, it offered no comfort, only temporary relief. Benches, ropes, and crowded spaces became functional, not cozy. Sleep was pursued with caution. Movement was measured to avoid disturbing neighbors. Quiet vigilance remained constant. The night was endured in segmented fragments, with one constant aim: to wake again. In the harsh rhythm of Victorian London, survival became the axis around which every day and night revolved. Decisions, morality, social connection, and even simple humanity were filtered through the lens of continued existence. Each breath, each step, each coin earned or saved was a reminder of the precarious balance of life. And yet, in this relentless pursuit, something quietly persisted: resilience. The body adapted, the mind focused, the spirit, while battered, learned efficiency in endurance. When survival became the only goal, the people of London discovered the depths of human persistence, proving that even in the bleakest conditions, life could be sustained, minute by minute, night by night, against every obstacle.